So for me, it's like, who are you bringing in? Who are you mentoring? And who are you passing the baton to? That's what I can do with my privilege.
This Restorative Justice Life is a production of Amplify RJ. Follow us on all social media platforms at Amplify RJ, sign up for our email list, and check out our website at amplifyrj.com to stay up to date on everything we have going on. Make sure you're subscribed to this feed on whatever platform you're listening on right now so you don't miss an episode. And finally, we'd love it if you left us a rating and review. It really helps us literally amplify this work. Thanks for listening. Enjoy the episode. Welcome to This Restorative Justice Life, the podcast that explores how the philosophy, practices, and values of restorative justice apply to our everyday lives. I'm your host, David Ryan Barcega Castro Harris, all 5 names for the ancestors, and I'm the founder of Amplify RJ. On this podcast, I talk with RJ practitioners, circle keepers, and others doing this work about how this way of being has impacted their lives.
Hey folks, I'm Elise, your producer, and today we are welcoming Erika Sasson as our guest today. Erika has studied human rights, law, criminal justice, peace and conflict, and so much more. She was involved in creating the Redhook Peacemaking Program, as well as being the director of the restorative practices at the Center for Court Innovation for over a decade, where she oversaw CCI's restorative initiatives across a broad range of disciplines. In this podcast, she discusses her experience in the criminal legal system and so much more. She can tell it better than I can, so let's get into this episode.
Erika, welcome to This Restorative Justice Life. Who are you?
Thanks, David, for having me. Who am I? I'm first relational. I'm a daughter. I'm a sister. I'm a wife. I'm a stepmother. I'm a mother. I'm a granddaughter still, which is really exciting. Those are my key relationships. I'm a neighbor also. I want to say that.
Who are you?
I'm a immigrant, daughter of a refugee, family all over the world. And this has become kind of increasingly interesting to me to think about what is it, married to an immigrant as well. What does it mean to be from so many different places? What does it mean to speak different languages? What does that do to your perspective? That feels kind of really important to me as I build an understanding of my identity that spans the Middle East in all kinds of ways, spans Canada, and now I'm an American, which is very bizarre and new for me. I just became an American. So my kind of geographic and linguistic identity is really mixed.
Who are you?
I'm someone who makes like a lot of faces on Zoom. And so I think it's going to be really different to do a podcast where you don't see, I think I'm really excited where you don't see all the face that I constantly am making. And sometimes I'm on Zoom calls and people are like, what is it? What's going on? And I'm like, nothing, I'm just making a lot of face. So I am definitely somebody who makes a lot of face. I don't know how that will translate into audio.
Who are you?
I really am someone who loves humor and pleasure and fun and connection, and I really like people. That's something about who I am. I think that's probably true, mostly true 6 days out of the week.
Who are you?
Oh my God. You're really gonna go for it asking me this 7 times. I've been thinking a lot. I mean, I'm dealing with mortality as everybody is in the pandemic. I'm thinking about it a lot. I'm thinking about my time, my life, my relationship to time. And I've been thinking a lot about the gap between our kind of huge infinite consciousness and then our little finite existence, and how so much about moving through the day, the week, the years is managing the gap between the two, and like how it impacts our identity and our sense of self. So I'm kind of, I'm somebody who can think who likes to think about that as well, like consciousness, presence, those things keep me up a little bit.
Who are you?
He's going to ask it again, folks. He is asking it again. I'm emerging. I'm just like, I'm emerging. There, I'll just give you one word for that one.
Yeah. Who are you?
Got it. Seven. Seven's the charm. I'm here.
Well, thank you so much for being here, Erika. We're going to explore a lot of the things that you talked about in those intersections, as well as your journey in this work of quote unquote restorative justice. But before we get going, it's always good to check in. So, to the fullest extent that you want to share, how are you?
Again, I'm happy to be here with you. You make me feel really comfortable. That's really nice. I am, I don't know, my kids just had COVID. I'm a working parent in a pandemic half of the time. Like that is really, that's what I should have answered for who am I and how I how I am is intimately connected to being a working parent in a pandemic. But I am right now kind of on the precipice of a transition and I'm feeling really energized by it. Really, I'm energized. That's how I am.
Yeah. Well,
How are you? Do
oh,
I get to ask you back? How are you doing?
I'll respond by saying like, I am excited to be having this conversation. Elise gave us a wonderful intro of you with like the fancy bio and titles and all those things. But I shared with you the last time that we talked that you're someone who I've recognized as like, oh yeah, like this is somebody who's like been doing some cool things, some innovative things within the context of your work at CCI. And this was I was learning about restorative justice. At the same time where I was involved with a project that was getting a lot of support from CCI, and I was like, oh, so Erika Sasson, like, cool, we're gonna we're gonna get to connect, and we connected a couple months ago and had an initial conversation. And I think that's what lends to this being a little bit more comfortable. And we decided that that wasn't a great time to record because of the transition that you're going through. And so, you are in this process of transitioning out of your role at CCI into some of the great things coming in the future. But this has been a long journey to get to this point. So I'm curious, from your perspective, how did this work get started with you? Probably before you knew the word restorative justice.
Yeah, I think that that's true for a lot of people. It's like restorative justice kind of just gives you a name or something to use for something you've felt before. I always think about Kay Pranis talking about this process of remembering. That always struck a chord with me, that we're remembering something that we used to do. I can give kind of a short answer that has to do with my first job out of law school, right out of the gate, was as a prosecutor, a federal prosecutor in Canada. And I want to say for the American audience that Canadian prosecution is different. It has certain different guardrails, I think, that are really important in how it's practiced. So it wasn't exactly like being a prosecutor here, but definitely similar. And I remember feeling, there was this experience, and I've talked about it before, so I don't want to repeat that, but it was so physical for me, the experience of being in a courtroom, because the way that the Canadian courtrooms were designed is that the person who was accused of the crime would be standing kind of behind me and to the right, and I was often standing, or sometimes to the left, but definitely behind me. And I would be facing the judge. So I was in Canada, you always stand when you speak to the judge. So I'm standing up and talking to the judge and talking about a person who is behind me, who I can't see. And the physical experience of that was like I used to get a neck ache because I'd want to look at the person who I'm talking to or talking about. I'd want to use their name. I wouldn't want to call them the accused, which is what the word we use for defendant in Canada. And so I'd want to say, Mr. So-and-so, and look at the person, but I can't look at the person because I have to look at the judge. And that was kind of my first, I would say that was like a hint that like, I'm in the wrong place because my body isn't enjoying the experience of what I'm doing. And then I would talk to defense counsel and I'd want to know about the person. I'd want to talk directly to the person. who was accused of a crime. And that was obviously a no-no. And there was always fun stories of me really connecting with people who were going through and knowing their names and them knowing my names. And I was looking for connection everywhere, despite the kind of natural barriers of the court and of the system. And so I was there for about 2-something years, and I, hightailed it and came to America to do my master's in law. And I spent the time doing my master's thinking about, what I had experienced and what did I learn, because I wanted to be in the system only insofar as I could really understand its mechanics, but not insofar as it would start to understand me and take me away from myself. So I did that short experience, and I felt like this need to connect, this need to talk directly, this need to be face to face was just constantly interrupted. That was maybe I'm in the wrong space and I'm looking for something else. I just don't know what it's called.
Yeah, 'cause I'm thinking about the first thing that you shared here was like the relationships that you have. You're someone who I've experienced as someone who's highly relational, wanting to be in good relationship with people, present company included, right? You're someone who studied peace and conflict studies. How does someone with those ideals decide like prosecutor?
Oh God. I mean, some of it is, the other part of the prosecutor is that you're in relationship with the judges and you're in relationship with defense counsel. And I was an actor before I was, even throughout law school, I was taking acting and, really serious about acting and the performance of court. If the content of what was going on in the courtroom were different, I would have stayed and been a litigator, because I so enjoyed the kind of high energy performance of everything. I just couldn't, the content, I would leave court and cry. And, I was a very high performing prosecutor in the sense that I, very focused, very, into my work and doing the right thing. And I had a lot of support to do what I thought was the right thing, which was incredibly important to me. And I had a wonderful boss who kind of supported me the way I was and didn't expect me to be something else. I wasn't different. I was really the same as I am now. Mm-hmm. And but it was very really, the courtroom is the most, the courthouse is, the court officers, everybody's just kind of in constant relationship. And that piece of it, I really loved. It was just the underlying issues that were really terrifying.
I'm imagining that most people listening to this conversation have not had to go through criminal proceedings in a court, right? I'm someone who spent a little bit of time in felony court as an intern in Cook County jail, and you realize that not only is a courtroom a place where people are tried and sentenced and all that, but it's also a place of work. right just we talk about how schools are places where students go to learn, but it's also places where adults go and work every day and are in relationship there. Those relationships matter. We're gonna circle back to that relationship piece within the context of the court workplace in a little bit when we get into your work at CCI, but take us through that journey of I'm done with this, I'm gonna look for something different, and find the words, quote unquote, restorative justice.
It's funny. I met my husband at the time. He was, I had just met him when I was deep in that world. And, right, this is funny, David, right before we started, we both did a self neck massage, mm-hmm. kind of get grounded. And it always takes me back because my husband gave me a neck massage. I remember when I kind of first met him, and I just started to cry, and I was just crying. And it was just a lot of the people that I had met and a lot of the things that I had seen were sitting on me in a bad way. And I always think about that moment. It's why are you crying? And I'm I don't know, nothing, everything's cool, everything's fine. But really I'm upset. I'm deeply upset. So that was almost my first self-indication that, this work is hurting. It's not giving me what I want, and it's not, allowing me to be in the world in the way that I want to be in the world. So there was that. And then I went to do a master's in law, and I used that as a way to kind of come into New York, I was I'm very Canadian. I didn't understand New York law or the, way things work in New York. And so I was really grateful to have a year of study and a year of reflection, which is so important for me. And, in that year, I studied with people like, James Gilligan, who writes about shame and violence and patriarchy, and David Richards. And there was professors who gave me a little bit of language around, what does silencing people mean? I mean, I don't think there's anything more silencing than the criminal legal system. And, just that fact, the fact that your deepest right, if you're accused of a crime, is, and you need that right. I don't ever take away the fact that people need the right to remain silent, but that right hurts you, and it hurts the people that you have hurt if you have hurt them. And it doesn't allow you to move through certain things. So it's like it's baked in, the thing that you need the most is baked into you're not moving forward in a good way. Working through some of those ideas kind of came through for me. Also, like I mentioned, I had been an actor, and like some of the things I love, love in the world around expression. Also, like, why do I love expression? Why do I love truth telling? Another way I could have answered your question, who are you? I'm somebody who really likes to say the truth. I really like it. I'm actually uncomfortable in like passive aggressive environments. I kind of can't take it. And, I'm like, I want to break it. Sometimes Zoom meetings, I like act out if people are too, and that's terrible. I have to just get off the Zoom meeting and stop acting out. But, I really value truth telling. And so those were some of the ideas that were starting to percolate for me after I left working within a courthouse.
Yeah. And so Masters of Law, Restorative Justice came in when?
Well, so there's like this whole other journey that happened also. All of our journeys are like multifaceted, and they kind of ebb and flow into each other like little streams, and making waves. But even before when I was in law school, I had spent a summer in Ecuador studying this indigenous form of justice of the Awa people, which is AWA. And they're an indigenous nation in Ecuador that they live deep in the cloud forest and the jungle in villages that are not hit by the mainstream Ecuadorian society. And they have their own justice system, and it's a lot of corporal punishment, but it's also a lot of shaming. And I think when they use shaming, they mean more reintegrative shaming, in the sense of saying what you did wrong and saying it in front of the community. And then again, there can be use of corporal punishment. And my job that summer was to study it. And so I would spend time in these remote villages. And that helped me to break a few of my maybe preconceptions about how things should be. I'd also say that I studied in Canada, and I studied the civil law system and the common law system in French and in English simultaneously. So again, between like the indigenous system and then my law studies that were two more systems, all of these things help you step out of the system and think, because everything is a choice. If you use corporal punishment, that's a choice. If you use civil law, that's a choice. Nothing is what is. I mean, this goes back again to this like idea of being from many countries and speaking different languages. Like, can you exist outside of your reality and figure out what is fiction, what has been decided, and what is endemic and necessary? And I think that my legal studies helped me do that. Helped me say, like, doesn't have to be a judge and a jury. It can be something else. So that's kind of a little bit of a prelude. And then I was so lucky. My first job at CCI was as part of this tribal justice exchange, which had me talking about, I would say, conventional Western legal practices with tribal justice systems. So there was this whole exchange of information between the New York system and different tribal systems. And as part of that exchange, I would travel across different native villages and reservations and see what's going on over there and hear what they were working on. And a lot of what they were working on was peacemaking. And so in that context, I mean, I think that really opened my world, because peacemaking was so special and I felt so privileged to be there. I did this one trip where we went to the Colville Reservation where they had a peacemaking program, but we brought two Navajo peacemakers to Colville to do cross tribal training, and I just got to be there, and that kind of level of exposure and nuanced exposure. Again, it's not this like monolith one peacemaking thing, this idea that I'm seeing two tribes exchange ideas and say, well, what do you do in this situation? Well, I don't know. Well, what do you do? Right. And like everything becomes a bit like a lasagna. That's such like a horrible food analogy, but there's just layers and it's not a monolith, but that was terrible. So I'm going to just pass it back to you.
Yeah, no, I'm curious. Like that was one of many instances where like you're able to understand that like just because something is written is not the way that things have to be, right?
Yeah.
You've been able to take multiple perspectives of how people go about problem solving, whether it is a peacemaking, whether it is shaming, whether it is through a formal process. As you observed those things, what were the things that stood out to you as like a little bit of this, a little bit of this, a little bit of that? Like, what are the common threads that you were like, this is actually what I want to be doing, and this is actually what feels right?
There was this amazing trip I made to Alaska, and I remember sitting in. It was with the Yupik Eskimo community, and I would just sit there, and they spoke in Yupik, which was beautiful as well, just to be in a village that spoke its original language. And I have this very visceral memory of they're speaking all in Yupik and it's all elders, and watching them listen to each other, not understanding necessarily, definitely not understanding what they're saying, but watching them listen. And it was, as I feel like, I'm from this kind of Middle Eastern Jewish family. There's a lot of hands, there's a lot of talking, there's a lot of interrupting in my family. And this slowdown that I have done over the years, which I don't do in a one-on-one dialogue, so no judgments, but I certainly experience in a peacemaking or in a restorative justice space, the complete slowdown, the complete listening without thinking of what I'm going to say to somebody else. That weight has been has been really special for me. And I use it in my personal life all the time. And I certainly use it in my professional life, that I can turn off the need to reply and the need to fix, and the need to be in control. Those are all things that I absolutely love to do. I love to do it in the courthouse. I love to do it in my, but like learning how to not do that has been probably the key to getting deeper into this work.
I guess what's been the hardest part about embracing that?
I think sometimes I want other people to do it, and I want them to get it, and I want them to just listen to each other, to me. And there's a cultural difference. There's this like culture of active listening, and it's a way of showing, people use it to show their compassion and their connection. And I experience it as alienating when people are like, so active into each other's, so I think sometimes like I can feel like a little impatient when people don't embrace it, but it's, I gotta just let people be.
I'm reflecting on when I first learned about Circle, right? And that, sitting through a training for 4 days, an experience for 4 days, with this deep listening, and like, yeah, like, and Aura Shub talking about how, Circle starts, the real work of Circle starts when you leave the circle, and like wanting to go out into the world, quote unquote, transformed, right, by this way of being. And then like nobody else in my life had that experience.
Totally.
Right. And so like, how do you invite people in without having that, that similar experience that you did? And like, I think there's something about modeling. I think there's something about having explicit conversations about, agreements about how we want to be together. But for people that you don't get to have those conversations with, that is something that I was like, well, damn, like existing within those two worlds and having to navigate both was a challenge.
I think
The center.
I was just gonna say, I think there's sometimes I remind myself that there's like a deeper lesson in a circle practice, which is that everybody is welcome and that we can't all agree. Like even when you think about making agreements, the agreement isn't what do you want? It is, what can we agree on or what can we live with? Not this idea that everyone is going to get exactly what they want, because that's just not the world we live in. And people are really different. And that's an amazing thing that you can get from circle practices, to be in community with people who are incredibly different from you. And so sometimes I just remind myself, like, don't forget that part of the circle practice either, that like you're supposed to be able to be with other people who are.
I'm curious, like to zoom out a little bit, just to like laser in on that. We could pick any number of issues that like we're facing in society at large, but let's just think about like wearing masks. How do we agree to be together in this circle way when we're talking about, from your and my perspective, life and death, and from somebody else's perspective, like my God-given freedom?
I mean, we're going to disagree clearly. I think so much this, like, there's something wrong when everything is about personal freedom, I think, I've actually was just asking myself this. I'm like, why do I think that, when I certainly feel that abortion is a choice, right? Like I absolutely deeply believe that. And, so it's like where I draw the line is different than where somebody else draws the line, and trying to understand what are the social and cultural factors that have come into where I draw my lines. And so I want to have I want to say that first, because I don't necessarily understand how we all kind of position ourselves. But if I was going to zoom out on the masks or on anything else like that, there's, the part, and to connect it to restorative justice, we just don't have a good developed sense of collective responsibility. We've just completely abandoned that whole ethic. And that's something that we get from restorative justice, from sitting in circle, from thinking beyond the individuals. Like if you want to have two individuals deal with their individual issues, go to you can go to mediation, you can go to the courts, you can go to anything that's designed to work around individuals. But what makes restorative justice special, in my opinion, is the zoom out about our collective harm, our collective responsibility, the extent to which we've enabled or fostered harm beyond what the individual has done. And so like that ethic is absent right now in America. It's just really absent, and in favor of an individualism that is like toxic and harmful. That is the issue, I think.
Yeah. Thank you for entertaining that. And like, I wasn't expecting XYZ answer. This is exactly what we do. That if it was that easy, somebody would have figured it out by now, right? Totally. But thank you for that. What you brought out in there is this idea of collective responsibility, like the interconnection between folks, that is so present throughout, in my experience, right? Through the way that Indigenous people across the world have moved and like built their lives around, built their communities around. You were initially exposed to this way of thinking, like through just problem solving, right? Like conflict resolution. Like you came to it from a lens of like, these are the ways that people are navigating harm. But I'm curious, like, as you were exposed to those ways, like, how did that ethic of interconnection and collective responsibility seep into, your understanding of this way of being that we're calling restorative justice?
Right. I mean, I think here I want to say, if I was going to go for round 8 of who am I, I'm somebody with really, really amazing teachers who have honored me in what they've shared with me. And so to answer this question, I would say I think really primarily of my teachers. So I think of a number of teachers in the Navajo Nation, but particularly Ray Deal, who really has taught me that this is about ceremony. It's really about like almost nothing other than ceremony, what is sacred and what is connected, and all of those pieces of the work. And so sometimes you can see a restorative justice that is, it can be a little bit more kind of like programmatic and one, two, three, but I kind of try to kind of pull into what I learned being on the Navajo Nation and participating in ceremony and having ceremony here in my home and in Redhook and, in different areas. And that, one time I remember I did a circle, it was a grief circle. I didn't say much. I had to kind of organize the circle, but I was just a presence, a community presence during the circle itself. I didn't facilitate it. And I realized that my job in that circle was just to pray, essentially. And I'm not like a religious person, but I found this ability to pray for the people who were grieving the person who had been taken from them. So that is a lot for me about what restorative justice is. I also think of Kay Pranis, who really has drawn out this idea of collective responsibility, of what does it mean to be part of the collective, that you can't have restorative justice that doesn't really draw on that. And so I would say that she has really opened my mind into that direction.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm thinking about how the word ceremony, right, means a lot of different things for a lot of different people. A similar word is ritual, right? I'm thinking about the contrast between the rituals of the criminal legal system and bringing this ethic of where it is in a lot of ways oppositional, like, and I think there is some idea of like collective responsibility of like safety, quote unquote safety for the public good, but the way that the rituals of the criminal legal system go about getting to safety aren't necessarily very humanizing, right? How do you bring restorative justice, peacemaking, collective responsibility into these systems through your work at CCI and in some other ways that you are, continuing to learn and grow in?
So now I want to say that I want to answer your who am I number 9. And I want to just, I'm going to answer it more than any of your other guests ever.
Sure.
And I feel like one who I am is I am comfortable. I'm ready to work in non-ideal spaces. I'm ready to work with what is and what is practical and what is impacting people, even when it cuts our ideals and makes us feel crappy. And that's, I think, how I would describe working with the criminal legal system, working in a big nonprofit. There are just so many moments of conflict that come up, or of saying like, this is not how I want it to be. And having that fight and having that debrief with your team and trying to kind of like understand, how are we going to be effective when we're fighting so many things? Maybe you're doing some really good work with people and then, it gets undone so easily by the monolith, by the system that is in place, or something else just kind of undoes all your work, and it can feel really demoralizing. I'll say something else. Sometimes, systems folks will be like, give us and I'd say this about schools as well, do your magic thing on this kid, or do this, fix this conflict. And, they're sprinkling, $10 and, whatever it is, like some kind of fraction of the energy and output of these giant systems. And they're asking you to kind of undo a lot of harm without any promise that they will kind of support that undoing down the road. And so there is a lot of it can be very demoralizing. However, I have we're just there chipping away, trying here, pushing here, having this conversation, having that conversation. I work with this prosecutor. We've been working on a homicide case now it's coming on a year. It's been a really long time. We're really trying to make it work. He's really coming at this in good faith, and I appreciate him. And he tries to understand what I'm saying. And he'll say something like, I could listen to you all day. I don't totally know what you're saying, but I could listen to it all day. He's trying, we're trying to bring our perspectives together. And we talk a lot about how we disagree on some things. And again, back to the truth telling, like I tell the truth about what I disagree with, but I also really try to respect what he's trying to do, which is to support a family. And I see that. So I'm not always at odds with the system that I'm working with, but I can be more specific if you want to hear like specific programmatic things that we've accomplished.
Yeah. In a 10-year career, I'm not expecting to hear all of them, but some of them would be great.
I think the most exciting kind of first thing that I ever got my hands into was designing and developing and implementing the Redhook Peacemaking Program, which runs out of Redhook, Brooklyn, trains community members from Redhook. I mean, there was a time that we trained a few people from outside of Redhook, and then we doubled down and said basically only people from Redhook, which is a very isolated community in Brooklyn that has a very large housing project, has a great community. And we train community people to sit in conflict with cases that can come either from the local court or directly from the community, and they are able to resolve it using peacemaking. They're trained, I say the word peacemaking because they are trained by Native trainers. I don't use the word peacemaking if there's no Native involvement at all. So in that project they are, and it's just been an incredible community. I would say that's a really incredible community journey because it really straddles some system involvement, but really enough community ownership and empowerment. And they've done some pretty incredible things over the years. And that's been running since 2013, so over 8 years, just about 9. And that was really like a standout, and it became a bit of a model for how to do things. But it was in a really boutique court, like in a small neighborhood, small court. For New York, it felt very boutique. And in the last couple of years, we've been thinking about how do you take cases from the downtown courts? How do you take cases? We have 1 million court cases a year in New York City, I think. Don't quote me, but we have a lot. Mm-hmm. And what does it mean to work in Manhattan, work in the Bronx, work in Queens, work in Brooklyn, like in their downtown courts, which are incredibly busy? And that requires a whole different set of skills. And, but we have managed to get cases diverted from those systems using including cases of, violent felonies, one homicide, working on another homicide, like serious cases. And, serious is in the eye of the beholder. So I don't always take the idea that a misdemeanor isn't serious. That's not true. But we've taken cases that are serious both to the system and to the people involved, and resolved them using a circle process. Using, most importantly, I would say, is making sure there are supporters in the room from their actual lives who are going to help them manifest what they're trying to manifest. So it not be this just professional facilitator model, but a model that either brings in community members or supporters or others to hold a broader space than just the conflict or just the incident. And that's really important.
Yeah. The reason that I became aware of you and your work is because of Redhook. You were someone who was in it, helping construct it with the community. Can you walk people through like what the process of going a case being referred and like how that case is handled?
So I'm going to do a generalized case that has come through our doors. So let's say 2 people have a fight, and it could be the different level of the fight. It can be a fight that's like, breaking a bottle and a punch in the face, or it can be, quite serious with a serious injury, or, really up and including, well, I'm going to leave the homicide to the side for a second, but let's just say 2 people who are both still living, who have a very serious fight, including serious injuries. 1 or 2 get arrested. So let's just say a situation in which sometimes both people get arrested if that's how it's called into the police. But let's say 1 person gets arrested. That person goes through the courts, and then either the prosecutor or the defense lawyer has had some contact with my team or has had some contact with restorative justice and understands that maybe this defendant feels incredibly remorseful, and the defense attorney is able to, it's really important that it be a strong case. If there's a legal defense, if there's somebody else involved, if it's not clear what happened, if it didn't happen, the person didn't do it, it's incredibly important for restorative justice process when I was leading it to say, we're not doing that case. We're not just going to take it out of the courts for you. We're only going to use a restorative justice process when people need to face what has happened and find a way to move forward, not when they want to deny what happens, which is a very legitimate thing that they can do, but just not with us.
Right. Oh, inherent to restorative justice, like if you're not going to take responsibility for what has happened, or you deny that it happened, right? Like that's going to cause more harm in the process.
It's going to cause harm in the process. Sometimes what happens, which is really complicated for people who do diversion work or work alternative to the courts, is you have people coming in who need an out from the courts. And they're like, well, you're my out. And you think the court is too punitive. I don't want you to go through courts. And you start to feel bad and you say, oh, maybe I could be this person's out. And that's the moment where I say, like, I want to help that person, but I cannot. And it's a really hard moment where you're denying somebody an out that you want them to have, but it won't have integrity in the process. And as you say, it'll cause harm both to them, and to the person maybe who has been harmed if you start to do that. Now, one more tactical thing, which is that people acknowledge responsibility, but they often have a very different version of events than the other person or than the police. And in my practice, it's okay to have a different version of events. It's okay to have your 10 justifications. It's okay to say they punched me first. Do you acknowledge having done that punch, and do you wish you could have done it differently? Not, do you have a story for why it happened? Because everybody has a story for why they do things, and we got to work through that. But I don't expect people to not have a story and to come like fully ready to say, no expectations on that front. We're really just dealing with, did you cause harm and you want to talk about it? Or did you cause some harm or some of the harm that is alleged? So that's the person who comes to us. So you say, okay, David, you're my guy. You threw that really serious punch and that person has injuries. And I say, okay, David, do you want to, and you've told your defense lawyer, like, I feel terrible about this. I actually just don't know what to do. And the defense lawyer maybe raises that with the prosecutor. Or more often, the prosecutor calls the victim who's like, I don't want to proceed with this. I know he did this thing, but I don't want him to go to jail, and I want to find another way to work through it. He lives on my block and we're going to have a fight again if we don't work through it. I don't want to look over my shoulder. If he gets a jail sentence, he's going to be mad when he gets out, because, he's going to come for me again. And I want to understand what happened, and I want to stop it from happening again. I think that those are almost the most key things. I'm the person who was harmed. I just want to understand what happened. I want to understand why they came for me in the way that they did. And I really don't want it to happen again, neither to me nor to somebody else. And if those are the feelings that are percolating in the people who are directly involved, and those ideas find their way to the lawyers, sometimes the lawyers will seek me out or somebody on my team and say, is this something that you can handle? And then the case would come, they would kind of agree on what would happen if we were successful. So the lawyers would say, if you're successful in restorative justice, either we will reduce the charge or we will have a dismissal, right? Like there will be some kind of drop in the sanction from the criminal legal system. We tell them all the time, please do a straight dismissal whenever you can, because that's what our goal. But then we would do a process. And the process is, as you said, it's really hard. It's definitely not an easy way out. It involves sitting with the person, at its best, and it's not always like this, but at its best, you're inviting someone, David, you're inviting a friend in your life who is either there, who knows you. I'll say to you, can you, like, who in your life, like, really loves you, really supports you, and tells you when you're wrong? Who's that person? Like, that's the person who I want you to invite into this. Someone who you fundamentally trust, but isn't afraid to tell you this isn't, what you're doing isn't awesome. And those people are the key to a process being successful, because often they will interject on behalf of the other person and be like, no, it won't be, and this is also really important, it won't be two teams meeting and duking it out. Then I think that that is not a way that I would recommend ever doing this kind of process. What you want is to prepare the people and their supporters. And if you can get community members, I always think that also helps, for everyone to imagine what it would mean to move forward, for everyone to imagine, like, what does prevention look like? What does healing look like? What would you have done differently if you could have? And then you bring everyone together. In Redhook, we always do food. I mean, it's been so awful in virtual world that we can't be physically together and do food. but we would bring food and let people relax. And then we would eventually set up a circle. It'd take a lot of time. Again, we're like, book 3 hours, please. Don't have anywhere to go for 3 hours. Eat together, sit together in a circle with in a circle of chairs with no tables in between, with a talking piece, which I'm sure your audience knows what that is. But if you don't, like, it's some kind of special object that the person who is speaking gets to use without interruption. So you get to say what you have to say. When you're done speaking, you would pass it. And pre-COVID, you would pass it. And then I don't know what you do in COVID. Everyone has their own.
Pass the hand sanitizer.
Pass the hand sanitizer and spread
yeah.
it. Keep going. But you say what you have to say in a guided conversation. And this is also really important. It's not a free for all. I tell people when I'm preparing them, I'm going to let you know when you have to, especially if the stakes are very high. So if it's like a low scale community conflict where it's, that people aren't going to go off, or if the loss isn't so big, or, whatever, depending on the stakes. But the higher the stakes, the more I prepare people to say, I'll let you know when to speak. Don't worry. There will be a structure. There will be a container for these feelings. There will be a break there, right? Like all of these things that help people be calm. There will be values depending on, again, on the stem. Sometimes in a peacemaking, we won't do values if it's not that kind of, folks won't like it, or they don't want that kind of thing. But if the stakes again are really high, I will do values and make sure that everybody understands why we're here. And then you move through a conversation that is, again, guided. In my practice, it's very organic. It's not necessarily, what happened, who was impacted, and kind of scripted. It's often more organic, but again, the higher the stakes, the more tight I keep it. And give everyone a chance to speak, however many times that we need. Take a break, and then at the end come to some kind of agreement on how to move forward. Sometimes we can't get to an agreement, and you can just feel it in the room, like it's just, there is no agreement here. So then what I suggest is, like, let's take a step. What's our step forward? And let's meet again in 2 weeks. And that's kind of how it works until you get to a final agreement, and then everyone will write it. And the agreement might be, we live in the same block together and we're going to say hello when we see each other, or I'm going to not step on your this, or I'm going to not use that derogatory word, whatever people need to have had their situation acknowledged. It could be restitution in some cases if there was property damage, right? It can be whatever the conflict requires. But I'm going to say one more thing, which is that sometimes in restorative justice, we talk about like people's needs and the people in the conflict kind of coming to consensus or coming to a decision. I think that that's really important, and it's true. But I also like to include there's a but there, which is that I like to include other community members and supporters and kind of a broader perspective, because there's other, there is this sense of like, what is the collective harm? What is the collective responsibility? And sometimes you do need to pull people out of their narratives into the bigger picture. And it can't just be kind of like 1v1 type of outcome. So
thank you for that walkthrough. For people who haven't thought about the intensive nature of working through all of this, and thinking about like restorative justice being like, oh, this passive, like, slap on the wrist, say you're sorry, move on, like, that's really, really, really not what this is. Even the processes to have those conversations about, like, are you willing to take responsibility for the things that you've done, right? Like, that in itself is a tough conversation to, have to face the harm that you've caused with someone else who, like, is trying to help you out, much less doing it in front of somebody who you've caused harm. The criminal legal system, as it traditionally exists, like, doesn't allow for any of that dialogue, right? You talked about how it takes away the voices of almost everybody involved, right? It's left up to lawyers to present a case, right? And then, you have victim impact statements, or, statements after sentencing, or at sentencing about, trying to influence like the way that sentencing goes. But, in this way of seeing each other as, having responsibility to each other, being collected, being like members, like mutual members of a community, like this really does allow us to if not get back into like sunshine rainbows right relationship, like you shared with agreements, how can we live together, right? um, Preventing this harm from happening
Or
again.
how can we live separately but have said what we needed to say so that we can move on personally? Like a lot of people don't need to live, so I appreciate what you're saying about, it's not kumbaya. It's not going to, that's not what's happening. But, do you get, how often do we sit in conflict with people in our own lives? I mean, for people who are like, maybe this does sound like a slap on the wrist. It's so easy. You just go, you just say sorry. Like, think for yourself, like, dear listener, of a conflict in your life that just sat on your back or sat on your heart, and you never told the person how you felt, and you never felt like you had an opportunity to explain what you had done, or, like what was going through your head, and you felt really misunderstood. And I'd say for this part, like, why does it matter? It's like getting that off, that the idea of getting something off your chest. It really feels like a foot on your chest. Like if you have not expressed your version of something, or you've been blamed for something that didn't feel like it happened that way, and or something happened to you and you were harmed and you didn't get to ever understand, like the way that those stories sit with you. One of the things we're really trying to do is give people a release. Be able to share what happened to you, be able to say those things. And we don't do it naturally. So again, to your listeners, like imagine a family member that you've never properly figured out why there's that strange dynamic between you. It's hard to do on your own. And we don't have spaces that literally facilitate us being able to say the difficult thing, say the truthful thing without flying off the handle, slamming the door, all of the things that we do. Or, that's more my version when you're like an extroverted kind of, but like, or you say nothing, retreat, isolate from family and friends, and all of the things that happen when we don't deal with conflict. And so that's why why it's needed and why it's hard, is because like we don't do it because it's really hard. It's really, really hard. And I know I recently sat through, watching, I don't think I've ever seen accountability that bravely as I saw in the spring when I facilitated my first homicide case. The man who had done this, he had never had to face what he had done, like facing the daughter of the person who was killed. And it was the most, and I have permission to share this, it was the most brave space I've ever seen in my whole life. It was so difficult. I was exhausted after it, because we really were holding something for the most tender conversation, the most awful conversation to take place. And this is the part, specifically that I have permission to share. The person whose father had died said that she slept for 3 days after it was done. And she had been waiting to meet the person who had done this. And she said difficult things to him. Again, it was not kumbaya. She said the truth over and over and over until he got it. And when she left, she slept for a number of days, and then she just felt like 1,000 pounds was lifted off of her. And she shared that her kids felt that their mother was returned. Like there is so much that comes from this, and it is not easy.
The follow-up question that I had when I initially asked you to describe the process is, how in the world is this scalable, right? Because you just talked about like, what does it look like to bring in cases from in the city, right? Much less thinking about, dismantling the prison industrial complex, abolition. It's as much about the dismantling as like building these structures and systems. I don't know if scalable is the right word, but how do we, if from your perspective, increase our collective capacity to do this work? I think there's an answer that talks about like, individuals and communities just having these skills to be able to navigate conflict and harm in a better way. We do still live in a world with an enormous criminal legal system that is dealing with all kinds of harm in ways that aren't necessarily getting people those kinds of quote unquote results.
I mean, when I did this project in Brooklyn high schools, I did a large scale trial of restorative justice in 5 Brooklyn high schools. And so that is the beginning of, I would say, that's not scale at all, because there's 1,700 schools in New York City. But it was like, okay, we have this kind of bigger budget and bigger ability and more staff. We kind of had all of that. But one of the things that was really glaring was how we're trying to do this in an area that's so resource poor, and the bigger picture, like the social picture behind it that causes so much conflict, is not being addressed. So here we are trying to put like all these band-aids on all these kids who really need, they don't need to talk about harm and they don't need to talk about conflict. They need after school programming and tons of food in the school, and they need to be not treated as small prisoners when they walk in, and there needs to be light in the classrooms. Like, they literally don't need what we're offering, and they got a lot out of what we're offering, but they need these like real basics. And I feel the same way about New York City. I feel the same way when I hear this question about scale. I'm like, the scale, I think restorative justice could be scalable in a world in which we had healthcare and which we had housing, and which we weren't constantly having to recover from systemic harm. But to ask restorative justice and community-based restorative justice to, it's like there is this gaping wound, and you're asking these tiny little practitioners to scale something up. I think I'm slightly allergic to the question because I've obviously gotten it a lot, and I think I end up thinking that it's a trap for people in our movement to have to answer, because we certainly cannot fix what is happening here with just restorative justice and everything else staying the same. Like, even if you invested in restorative justice, but you left everything else, we magically got tons of new money, and we were able to really build, these cadres of people across the city doing this work. We can't do that because people don't have what they need to feel like they are in community and that they are connected to one another. And we certainly don't have it in the environmental catastrophe that we're facing, and we're not thinking preventatively about anything. And so if we're just going to be reacting to, all of the environmental catastrophes and not build any, I'm thinking like, again, like metaphorically, if you think about like what's happening with our climate, and we're just responding to the latest crisis, constant crisis management without any long-term visioning, like your crisis management is just not going to keep up. And I feel that way about restorative justice. Like, we can't keep up. There's too much harm happening all the time, harm that is preventable, unnecessary, malicious, and I speak specifically about systemic harm that is malicious and racist, and it's so unnecessary. And so I don't want to set up restorative justice practitioners to be, having to undo all of that. It's like, no, I say no. We're not doing it. I'm not doing it.
Right. It is like thinking about what are the things, as much as it is about like being able to respond to harm, like what are the things that would have prevented harm in the first place, right? And all of those things that you shared. Some of those things can exist within the structures of a school or like a small community, and those are things that we can put on. I hesitate to say this. Those are things that we can put on like individuals to collectively come together and take responsibility for. But when we're talking about lack of healthcare, houselessness, lack of resources for mental health, right, among all these other problems, like the prison industrial complex doesn't go away just because folks now have tools to deal with harm.
Exactly. No, I actually feel this way about, maybe it is about so many years in restorative justice, and like repair harm. Like, is that what we want to be doing? No, we want to be preventing. We want to, like, what do I use restorative justice for? To really listen properly, understand what needs are, and then respond in a much bigger picture way about preventing future harm. Harm, this, I know this, whatever harm we've endured in our life stays with us, and we move through it, and we create scars, and we don't walk around with open wounds anymore, and we need help to create the scarring and to move out from the open wound. And that's beautiful, and I support it, and I will continue to do it. But it's, the scar is never going away, and we're never erasing harm. And so I think a lot about, like, in a way, how do we just move forward from, we need to prevent more harm, and we're smart enough to know how to do that, but we need collective thinking. We need to understand that we're interconnected. If we don't have a fundamental understanding of interconnectedness, this whole thing fails. And so I know, like, do I want to repair harm all the time that is just caused over and over? That was really evident to me in the school in the context of a school. It's just like over and over and over and over and over. And you're like, I'm out of band-aids. So just please stop causing this gaping wound and we can move forward.
Like, speaking specifically to the school context, some of the things that many adults in building space are like, I'll just categorize them as like power struggles with young people, right? That's where a lot of conflict happens. Like, what is your orientation towards that young person where you think that you have power over them, right? And how do we switch that to something where there is, shared power, thinking about yourself as being interconnected? I know everybody has roles to play as far as keeping people safe and facilitating learning, right? But that doesn't necessarily have to come at the expense of seeing the other person as like fully human. We take it out of the schools and we think about something like domestic abuse, assault, right? Like, what is the thing that we have to prevent to make sure that those things aren't happening, right? What are the economic factors that people who are experiencing this kind of harm are facing? How can we alleviate those things? And so it's not just as simple as like we repair it when it happens. It's like, what are the societal factors? Oh my gosh, so much. And we're already over an hour. So the process that you described at Redhook is one of the projects that you worked on at CCI. I know that you weren't saying this, but that is not the only way that restorative practices, restorative justice can happen. You just described the model that you helped construct, and that program is still running, slightly modified because of COVID, I imagine. But there are people who are still at the Center for Court Innovation in that peacemaking program who are doing that, and so we can drop links to connect folks with the folks at CCI. You're not at CCI anymore. Well, at the time of this recording, you are in your last week at CCI. By the time this airs, you're not at CCI anymore. What is next for you?
Thank you for asking that. I'm really excited. I finished 10 years at CCI. It felt like, we haven't even talked about, we started to talk about intimate partner violence, but we did a lot of work over the years around intimate partner violence, around actually using restorative justice to have the conversation, having a deep and loving conversation with people who work in domestic violence and intimate partner violence, to understand what are they afraid of when it comes to restorative justice and how can we move forward with them, not against them, but with them in making these options available for survivors of that kind of violence. And that has been, I want to say that there's a lot of work with Redhook Peacemaking. There's a lot of work with the major courts in our system, but there has been a ton of work that we've done on having that conversation with policymakers, with advocates, with survivors, to understand what they need. That I really do want to highlight, because I think we in a way used restorative justice for the pursuit of the conversation, which I think has been healing for a lot of people. And so I do want to drop links as well to the work on that front.
Is there anything that you want to further highlight right now?
I mean, we did a blueprint for New York City. We did to think about how to use restorative justice and intimate partner violence. We did a national study. We just really tried to lay the foundation for having a good conversation and opening up these options, which can be very much closed. And people get very defensive around them. And I understand why they're defensive, because we've had a lot of meaningful conversations that have hopefully started to open some of these pathways and participated in that with people from around the country that have just really led the way. So I'm very proud of that work as well. I'm proud of the work in addressing harm. I'm proud of the work in our schools that we did. We have a great podcast on our work in the schools that I'd love to drop the link to that too, because it talks about structural racism and what we saw and how we dealt with it and our journey as a team on that front. So there's, we did schools, intimate partner violence. We're starting something on reentry. I felt at the end of this decade, like we had really just kind of built. I work with incredible people who are still leading there, a body of work to understand, how far to go in this work and what can you do with it and how can it help us shift things in different arenas of our lives. But I felt like I had reached this kind of point where, it's time for me to think, more personally on how I'm going to live my time and how I'm going to be in the world. And I got really excited with the idea of leaving. It's a really large organization, so that brings its own type of work. And so I wanted to consult on my own and see what that would feel like. And so I'm working with individual clients and individual organizations that are trying to design programming, trying to understand what restorative justice is. What are people talking about? What does that mean? Can I use it in this particular case of harm? So working with different organizations, people who want to build out new programming. And I'm also going to continue to facilitate complex processes like in the aftermath of homicide. So just keeping my own practice going and trying to kind of connect with myself. I've done, I wonder if my team will be hearing this, but I love to mentor, and I love to be in a relationship with very particularly the people who were on my team. And I poured a lot into them, and I'm really proud of like the pathways that they are on. But it's like, it's part of being a mother as well, and a stepmother, where you're thinking of others a lot and wanting them to grow and succeed. And I felt I was at this point in my life where I said, okay, you're here too, and let's take that pause, that reflection year, and pour into self as well. So I'm trying to do that for myself right now.
The theme of taking pauses has come up a lot, and by the time this airs, hopefully I'll be in the middle of one of those. So total advocate for that, and really excited to see all the things that come out of your rest, because not only are you coming out of these 10 years, we're all 18 months now into this really traumatic, life-altering time. So excited for the rest in and of itself for you, and for the people that you'll get to work with moving forward. As you think about doing this work in the body that you're in, all the intersections of your identity, acknowledge one of those is a white person largely working in a system that both the criminal legal and school systems with people of the global majority, specifically Black folks in Brooklyn. What do you see as your role in the skin, in the body that you're in?
It's been so ever present in the work. Specifically, it's like the specifics, the generalities. I mean, working in public schools in Brooklyn, working in a criminal justice system, this has largely affected Black populations. And again, moving, as you say, in a body that is white by American standards is incredibly present to how I understand it. It's given me a lens to understand what's happening around me. I think the piece of Native peacemaking that's about ancestry has been really important to me. So like in, a lot of like going back, understanding where we came from as individuals, as part of clans, or as part of groups or ethnicities, or as part of races, like understanding our history is something that I learned through Native peacemaking as being incredibly important to the healing process moving forward. And understanding context, that you are not just this one being, you are part of something. You are part of this interconnectedness, and you are part of a history. And that history is, back to the death and dying, like what is our relationship to time? And what happened before is present today. And so we've done a lot of, in our work, especially in the last 3 years, in the podcast that I mentioned earlier, we talk a lot about where racism and restorative justice intersect, and can racial justice come from restorative justice, or can restorative justice help racial justice? Like these things are so intimately connected. And I do think they have to do with bringing our histories to the fore and facing them and truth telling around them. That is what I have. I think you're asking about me personally, like moving as a white person in Black communities. And I don't want to avoid that question, so I will answer that question. But the part to me that that I think we can like also bring forward is our sense of like truth telling around history, truth telling around the present, truth telling around all the time, truth telling, that is the beginning of undoing some of what is around us. And it is the avoidance and it is the minimizing and the excusing that we see in individual harm, and we see it in collective harm. Constant, like a default to minimization and a default to victim blaming and a default, like those are the things that are like causing so much harm. When I talked about the schools, and I was like, that they could just undo some of the general harm, we could stop putting band-aids on things. And I feel that way also about racial justice. Like there is no moving forward without truth telling on what happened. This country, it's like we shouldn't be putting restorative justice in schools before we're putting racial justice in schools. Like we can't move in any direction without truth telling around the past and around the present. Like that seems really vital to me. And that's what I get from restorative justice as regards racial justice. Now, in terms of moving through the world, I've had a position of privilege. I think a lot about, I've moved, we've talked about this, I've moved through different cultures. I like to be around people who are different from me. I like to learn from people who are different from me. So I've, on the one hand, absorbed and listened and learned as much as I can. But in terms of like running in America with a position of power and seeing it happen over and over again and kind of starting to really understand the implications of that, I think a lot about, so there's kind of these like huge systemic problems that we see with our kind of infinite consciousness, and then we have our finite abilities. It's like what we're talking about right at the beginning around who am I? I'm a finite person facing this kind of huge harm. And one of the things we started to do in the schools work, because we would get really demoralized by the huge harm, is just kind of like block that out of your mind and say, okay, what can I do? Not what needs to be done, what is stopping us from getting things done, but what can I do? And, it was very clear to me as somebody who was a manager, who was hiring, I can hire Black people. This is an issue in Black communities. I can hire Black people. Okay, well, then you look at the roster of candidates and there aren't a lot of Black people with restorative justice experience. And this has been traditional. Like there's a lot of white people coming to me. Doesn't matter. I can hire people who are going to have specific connections to the communities that they're going to serve, and I can train them on RJ. They don't have to come with that training, right? So you have to like think about what can you do to not kind of fall into perpetuating things. And then, and this kind of came up recently and it has to do with my transition, I'm really excited to be passing the baton to the people that I did train and hire who are Black to run this and to do this work on their terms and with their analysis, and to shift and change and shape the work in a different way. So for me, it's like, who are you bringing in? Who are you mentoring? And who are you passing the baton to? That's what I can do with my privilege. I can't, sometimes you want to do a whole lot more. One of the things that I did in my time was like find the funding so that we can research ancestry and we can spend our time looking at history. So our team went to Alabama right before pandemic to go to the Montgomery Memorial and really like touch down in that way, because it felt really integral to our work in Black communities, and there was a majority Black team.
And to be clear, these were people with incredible experience and incredible resumes. They just didn't have the restorative justice experience, and that was something that was access that I could provide. And I mean, it goes back to what you were saying right at the beginning, David, about when did you come to restorative justice but didn't know a name. A lot of those people that we hired, they were here for the work. They just didn't have the name for it. I remember this one completely brilliant candidate. I had to stop myself from hiring him on the spot. His whole essay was about his name and about his story and about who he was, and breaking all of that down as a way of showing how he wanted to be part of this work. And if that's not restorative justice, then I certainly don't know what is. And then he learned some of the technical stuff, and he learned circle practice down the road. But it was really exciting to hire him and not overlook, because we're looking for certain resumes that look exactly like our own, and we're just trying to like repeat what looks like yourself.
And so those are the things I can do. I can't necessarily do more, but I can value the voices of of people who are directly impacted. I can find my ways to empower them and to support, and to pull back when I need to. And that's, I think, really, really important. It's something that you do learn in circle, is when to be quiet, when to again, pass the baton.
Yeah. Thank you. And there's no right answers, right? It's your answer. And I'm appreciative of you going there. Um, the balance of like leveraging privilege and power in the spaces that we're in, and then giving it up, right? It is a tricky balance that like I think about a lot, not as a white person, right, but as a cis man, right, as someone with a certain level of education, with a certain level of like economic privilege, certain level of ability. Those things like constant for me. But thank you for going there. We've talked around the ideas, but for you, define restorative justice.
I see restorative justice as highly relational. You want like a full definition. It is a way of connecting through good and through bad that is prefaced on our interconnectedness and on the sense that we all matter. And that the best way to move through good and bad is to come together, make agreements, and move forward together. The best I can do today.
For sure. What has been an oh shit moment, and what did you learn from it?
I feel like I have an oh shit every time I do a very complex circle. I have an oh shit moment where I think it's too hard. People are going to freak out. So I've had it like really many times. Like honestly, every time we sit down and you bring people together and it's very charged and you think you're never going to make it through the tension. You know, people come into a conflict circle and they're like at opposite ends of the room, and you think like, what have I cooked up here? This is just, crazy. And you, again, like I bring myself into the structures. I always say like, you got to stack the deck in your favor. So, get that food out, get the seating right, get people, use the talking piece. Like don't cut any edges, don't cut any corners. And often we'll move through it, and it'll be those two people who came separately will literally leave together, and I'll watch it happen, but I almost don't believe it every time. I like, again, don't believe it. I'm like, this is never going to work. This is, so that's my real, like, I get really nervous that people can't move through stuff. And then I remember that they can.
Mm. For sure. There's like this balance of follow the steps, follow the process. Has there been a moment where it's like, oh no, this is not, we need to adjust?
I mean, just recently I did a very serious case, and I'm putting out the centerpiece, and the person who'd been accused of the harm looks at it and you just see the panic. He's like, what is that? And I realized I hadn't told him what those things were going to be. And I just looked at him, looked down, packed it all up, put it away, and was like, we don't need this. Right? Like, this is about you. This is about you being comfortable. Like, you don't need my centerpiece. Nothing that's going to make, everything should be in service of the good communication, and all of the things, the tricks that I use should not be against the good communication. So for example, I've had cases where people break the talking order. We use an order to speak. So I have the talking piece, then I pass to you, and then you pass to the person next to you. And it's supposed to be very orderly, and the orderly helps the good communication. But every once in a while, the two people who are really at the heart of the project, the issue, just need to speak to each other. And that's why you have a talking piece, is to help them get to that point. So if they are dropping the talking piece and just having that moment of back and forth that they really need, then again, I'm not going to be like, no, use this. No, like, we are here in service of all of those things, are in service of this being harmonious. And if you are getting there on your own, I certainly don't impose the structure.
Right. It's quote unquote, knowing the rules, knowing the structures, breaking them when it is in service of the intent of the structures, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Beautiful. You get to sit in a circle with 4 people, living or dead. Who are they? And what question do you ask the circle?
Oh, I mean, I definitely, my grandfather who passed when I was 6 has got to be there. I get anybody I want.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I want the Dalai Lama. I want Cardi B.
Mm-hmm.
Who else do I get?
One more.
Maybe my son, Ezzy.
And what's the question you ask your grandfather, His Holiness Cardi B, and your son?
I will say I didn't even know who Cardi B was 5 years ago, and I'm completely gone on the deep end there with her. What is important to you?
If you were asked that question in a circle, how would you respond? In a circle with those people, how would you respond?
And with those people, I would say that facing my mortality is important.
In what way?
I'm afraid of uh, dying without coming to terms with what that means or having it sprung up on me. I'm afraid of living in a way that doesn't include knowledge and comfort around dying.
I feel like that's a whole nother conversation that is hours long that we're going to save for another time. Thank you for sharing that, though. We've talked mostly about how this work plays out in your professional life. How has this way of being impacted the way that you move through the world as Erika?
I mean, I think a lot, I wouldn't say most, I don't want to generalize, but I think a lot of people come to work on something.
Mm-hmm.
Some people think that you do this kind of work, you must be some like super peaceful person who never fights with anyone. And I tend to say, like, no, I understand conflict. I live conflict. And I'm first of all comfortable with it, which means that if I'm around it with other people, like I can be there. But on the other end of that is like I am just trying to understand how to be with others in this world, and how to understand myself and how to understand my own ways of moving in the world. Like, you develop a sense of self-awareness, I think, if you're in circle a lot where and if you develop good relationships with people who can give you real feedback and give you your own path for moving forward. Like, you can't ask anyone in a circle something that you wouldn't be comfortable answering yourself. And so that constant placement that it's not about others, it is about, it's about us as together. It's about me as an individual. It's about you as an individual. We are not the same, but we are connected. And so just trying to live that in my life and be better and understand myself more and have compassion for myself and for others. I'm trying to work through all that stuff. And I want to do it all the time. I don't want to do it, back to the death and dying. I don't want to do it just when I'm like on my deathbed. I want to be working it through like here in real time.
Mm. We're coming to the last couple questions. What is one thing you want folks listening to this podcast to walk away with, whether it's a mantra, an affirmation, or maybe something else?
I think a lot of, I think about the people working so hard in the world of social justice, and it can be really demoralizing. And the thing that I took so strongly from my time at CCI and specifically with our RJ team is like build strong relationships with your team, have fun, support each other, but like have fun together. There's so much darkness. Move towards the light. Don't stay there.
Wonderful. This one comes with homework after. Who's one person I should have on the podcast? And bonus points if you can help me get them on. Because you can say Obama, but unless you have the connect, it's like,
I'm just going to look up. I don't want to mispronounce his last name, but I have an idea. We're going to have to wait. Richard Cruz. He works at the Ahimsa Collective. He's brilliant.
Beautiful. We'll make that connect. And then finally, how and where can people support you, your work, in the way that you want to be supported? As far as like your upcoming work, I know you said like no website yet.
Maybe by the time this podcast airs,
maybe by the time this podcast airs, we'll keep people updated with the links in the show notes for connections on
program design and, you know, deep thinking on restorative practices, on facilitating complex harm. I'm here for it.
Beautiful. Linked in the future show notes, and will be updated when eventually that does happen. So come on back. Thank you so much, Erika, for your time, your stories, and the wisdom that's come through that. I'm sure the people who have listening have learned a lot. I definitely have. To everyone else who's listening, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. We'll be back with another one next week. Until then, take care.
Thank you, Erika, for all the wisdom you had to offer. I really loved when Erika said, how often do we sit in conflict with people in our own lives? I think it is so important to remember that even for small conflicts with the people that we know and love, it is important to have a restorative approach to that. It doesn't have to be super fancy, but as long as we are practicing restorative values on small-scale conflicts, then that can help set the precedent that we use restorative values in all situations if there is a larger conflict. And it's really hard to remember these restorative values, especially in a heated moment of conflict. But I found that this challenge is really important to keep in mind at all times. Restorative justice is really hard work. It is hard to be in conflict, and it is hard to seek a restorative approach, but it is so worth it. Vulnerability can sometimes feel like giving up control, but really, in restorative justice, vulnerability is creating a collective control and working together to maintain that sense of control and safety. How do you practice restorative justice in those small moments of conflict with the people that you know and love? Finally, I'd like to leave you with a quote from Erika. What makes restorative justice special, in my opinion, is the zoom out about our collective harm, our collective responsibility, and the extent to which we've enabled or fostered harm beyond what the individual has done. Seeking connectedness and collective accountability, I think, is a really good way to end off this episode. As always, don't forget to check out the links in the show notes below, and check out our Instagram and TikTok where we are posting more content with Erika and our other podcast guests. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next week.
Like what you heard? Please subscribe, rate, review, and share this podcast on whatever platform you're using right now. It really helps us further amplify this work. You can also support us by following us on our social platforms, signing up for our email list, rocking our new merch, joining our Patreon, or signing up for a workshop. So many options! Links to everything in the show notes and on our website, amplifyrj.com. Thanks so much for listening. We'll talk to you next week.